So, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. Welcome to the Arab Businessmen and Investors Conference. I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to the supporting organisations and the sponsors. And just to recap, yesterday's panels were discussing the global ecosystem, the importance of innovation, and the challenges that innovators and entrepreneurs face, particularly with funding. That set the scene for today's topics of integrating disruptive technology in day-to-day operations. And I'm actually positive that today's panels will prove dynamic. So let's get started. Our first session is called Disruptive Convergence, and I'm hoping by the end of this session we'll know exactly what that means. It's a keynote speech by Salim Ismail, and Salim is a futurist. He's a best-selling author as well. He's been building disruptive digital companies as a serial entrepreneur since the early 2000s. Salim is a founding executive director of Singularity University and co-founder and chairman of OpenXO, a global transformation ecosystem that connects world-class professionals with organizations, institutes, and people who want to build a better future through cutting-edge ideas and actionable methodologies. I saw somebody on the side there. Please welcome Salim Ismail. Thank you.
So I'm going to run through some slides talking through 3 or 4 basic points. One is, what is the nature and why are we seeing such disruption today? Secondly, what are the broader implications of that, not just for business, but also for society at large? But most importantly, what do you do about it? We're seeing today the biggest disruption in the history of the world. Certainly in civilization, we've never seen this level of disruption. And I want to talk through how do we deal with that, and we've actually been working on tool sets to actually navigate this world. So we'll just wait till my slides get put up somewhere. Quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of Singularity University? Quite a few of you, great. So my colleague Peter Diamandis, who's the real founder of it, will be speaking tomorrow in the closing keynote. So he and I have talked, and we've got a kind of a joint open and closed session, which hopefully should leave you fairly disrupted. While we're waiting for the slides to get put up, I'll just get started. So, in terms of my background, I'm actually from India originally. Did my schooling in university in Canada. I spent 10 years in Europe restructuring large European organizations, many French companies, which is why I'm bold. And if you've interacted with French companies, that will make sense. I see we've got a couple here. And then the last 20 years has been in the US. And most recently and most fundamentally, I was about 10, 12 years ago, the head of innovation at Yahoo. And I learned a really fundamental lesson trying to run their incubator, which is when you try disruptive innovation in any legacy environment, the immune system attacks you, right? Because all of our organizations, all of our institutions are built to resist change and withstand risk. And yet that's now the high-order driver. And how do we juxtapose with that is almost all of the work that we do now today. Just so, I want to just see a show of hands. How many of you have seen this image before? Can I see a show of hands? So if you look carefully at this image, there's a dog in the middle of this. Its head is to the ground. It's right in the middle there. You can see the left ear. You can see the left leg and the body. Does everybody see the dog? Let me make it easy. There's the dog, right? Now that you see the dog, I've played a trick on you. You can't not see it. Your brain is now stuck looking at the image of this dog. And once we see this, you can't unsee it, right? And the effect that we hope to have over today, tomorrow, and yesterday is that once you learn the full implications of technology and where the world is going, you can't unsee it from then on. So that's the objective, very, very ambitious. By the way, from a neuroscience perspective, we actually have no idea how this happens. We don't know how the brain creates a permanent one-way learning that literally can't be reversed. So in 10 years, if you see this image, your brain will instantly see the dog. So I apologize for that. You can curse me at the time. And so this is the objective we're hoping for today. In terms of, I told you a bit about my background, built out Singularity University, and then I'm now on Peter's board at the XPRIZE Foundation. The journey really starts here with this graph. This is a graph of Moore's Law that Ray Kurzweil put together. And he's basically looking at the history of computation, because we've seen that the price performance of computation doubles every 18 months. And that is driving the world forward very aggressively. What Ray did was he went all the way back to 1900, and we find that the price performance of computing has actually been doubling for over 100 years, way before Gordon Moore made his predictions. And the question that Ray asked when he saw this data is, why is this curve so smooth and so predictable? You know, we've had in the last 100 years wars and recessions and ups and downs in the semiconductor industry. You should expect a very jagged stock market shape, not this very steady progression that we see here. And so this didn't make sense. Why is this curve, this computational price performance curve, so predictable? And Ray spent 10 years researching this, trying to understand why this was happening. A full decade. And he came up with a really fundamental observation, which is once you take a domain, discipline, industry area, product area, technology, and you power it with information technologies, and it acquires informational flow properties, the price performance starts doubling very steadily. Most importantly, once that doubling pattern starts, it does not stop. It just keeps going. And that becomes very hard for us to understand. Cognitively, that makes no sense at all. We think it should end. It can't continue infinitely. But now we're actually seeing that that is the case. Once you have an information-based environment, the doubling price performance keeps going, and it doesn't seem to stop. And you can see in computation, multiple technologies, integrated circuits, transistors, vacuum tubes, etc. Each one is like an S-curve, where technology takes off, accelerates, reaches its upper limits. But if you have an information-based environment, something else always takes over the curve. So you can see in 5 different technologies we've gone through in computation, this has happened. We are actually now reaching the end of the price performance of integrated circuits. The chips are getting very hot down at the surface level. We're down to a few nanometers of wire thickness. But now we have multiple technologies, 3D chip design, optical computing, quantum computing coming along to take over the curve. Most likely quantum computing, which now seems to be an engineering problem rather than an invention problem. So we predict Moore's Law continues unstopped for as long as we can see. And so that's a key paradigm to think about. We have basically entering a world where we have infinite computation, infinite storage. Right? And what happens if that's the case? I joined Peter's board recently with some really interesting characters on this global board. Pretty much every board meeting now starts with, what did Elon just do? And then we move on to the rest of the business of the day. Peter will talk to you more about XPRIZE, but this is one of the prizes that I found most exciting coming from developing countries and emerging markets. This was a prize that we put up a few years ago to extract clean water out of the atmosphere. And the prize was, can you extract 2,000 liters of water a day for less than 2 cents a liter using only renewable energy? Okay, so this is a huge attempt. 2,000 liters is enough for a village or a large apartment building. And to our surprise, a year ago, this prize was won. So we now have a machine that can extract clean water out of the atmosphere in most parts of the world, unless you're in the Sahara in extreme desert conditions. And if you have clean water, you take out half of all the diseases in the world. Right? So the ripple effects go very, very quickly. And if you want to think about a huge business opportunity, we should commercialize this machine, and it becomes an instant export industry to 3 or 4 million villages around the world that all need this type of technology. Okay? But that doubling pattern that we've seen in computation, and we've lived through all of our devices now, we're now seeing that doubling pattern in a dozen technologies. And this is completely unique. In the history of our world, At any point, maybe one technology was accelerating or another. Never have we seen this many all at the same time. For example, drones are doubling every 9 months in their capability. The price performance at which we can sequence the human genome is doubling every 6 months in its capability. The resolution at which we can image the human brain is doubling about every year. And as I said, we've never seen this before. A dozen technologies all moving at a very, very fast pace. And as I said, it's very, very hard to spot this. Cognitively, our brains do not understand this curve. All of our education, training, intuition about the world teaches us linear extrapolation. You take your past performance, you draw a line, here's where we could be. But on an information-based heuristic, we're operating on a very, very different paradigm. As an example, if I take 30 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I take 30 steps linearly, I'll go 30 meters. I'll get to the back of the room. And we are very good in our brains of understanding cognitively where might I be a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that progression. We're very good at linear extrapolation. But if I take 30 doubling steps, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, at step 30, I've actually gone 1 billion meters. I'm 26 times around the world, which is a little bit further than the back of the room, right? And very hard to gauge where am I a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that projection. And so cognitively, our brains have a very, very difficult time with this. When we see these results, we kind of go, this can't be possible, and we reject it. And this is one of the cognitive biases that we have. When you apply this to industries, we see things in typically 3 layers. The vast majority of our history is here at the bottom here. Almost all of our industries, almost all of the business models, value creation, revenue generation came from the sheer physicality of the world. We extract resources, we assemble raw materials, we ship things around and so on, right? Then we added a layer like the Kindle or the iPhone where the product is physical, but all the revenue is digitally driven and information-based. And with the rise of mobile, internet, and so on, we now have entire industries that are completely digital with very little physical manifestation at all. And the world, of course, looked like this. And now we're seeing this flip around, and more industries are moving up that stack and becoming digitally driven, information-based. I write in the book that I wrote that the Tesla is not only a car with computers and sensors in it, it's a computer with wheels. Right? And you look at it very differently when you look at it from that perspective. Actually, one of our alumni corrected me and said, you're wrong about that. Think of the fact that the Tesla updates itself every few weeks. You have to think of it as an app that has wheels, right? Which is really ridiculous at one level, but directionally very, very correct. And so as we move to this information-based paradigm, the business models, revenue generation, value creation all come from the information-driven aspect of the world. And as I said, we're seeing these dozen technologies. And Peter has done some work looking at how do you think about the dynamics of this. And we see 4 major dynamics, and I'll run through them very quickly as you understand much of this. So the first is that we're digitizing everything very rapidly. 10 years ago, we had maybe 500 million internet-connected devices in the world. Sometime next year, we'll get to about 50 billion. But we're doubling every year. So we'll go from 50 to 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 billion devices in just a few years. And think of that one metric, 50 billion next year going to 1 trillion. We think we're 30, 40 years into the information revolution. On this metric, we're at 5%. We're literally just starting. So most of this disruption is ahead of us as opposed to behind us. Right? And as we can see, we're digitizing pretty much everything that moves in a very quick, fast way. And when you digitize, things become very, very disruptive. And the best framing and analogy and metaphor we have found for that disruption is photography. Some of you are old enough to actually remember film photography. You're operating from a scarcity model, right? You're operating on a physical image, on a physical chemical substrate. And when you're operating in that model, you're operating, all the business models are scarcity driven. It costs about $1 a photograph, takes a few days to get your prints back, and so on. And you get a whole bunch of business models that crop up around that scarcity. People publish books on composition. I may offer courses on photography to help you optimize so that every photograph you take is a good photograph because each click costs you $1. We sell very expensive cameras and so on. But when I move to digital photography and I move to the information-based environment, three fundamentally important things happen. First, marginal cost goes to zero. Right? Now I can take 1,000 photographs, the cost doesn't change at all. As a result of that, the domain completely explodes. In film photography, I'm very carefully clicking here or very carefully clicking there. Today, we're basically holding the button down on all of our devices and taking billions of times more photographs because the cost is gone. I challenge you to take a photograph of somebody and not click 4 times because the cost is gone. Right? The third thing that happens because of this explosion of the domain is you change the problem space. And what do I mean by that? In a scarcity environment, as I said, you have these business models around scarcity. And all of our revenue, most of our industries, almost every business in the world is selling scarcity. If you don't have scarcity, you literally don't have a business. But now, when you go to this new model and you digitize, now we have an abundance problem. Now the problem that we have in photography is we all have 8 copies of our photographs on 10 devices, and you can't find anything. Right? So you've gone from a sourcing problem to a filtering problem. More importantly, all the business models around scarcity disappear. Nobody can make money offering courses on photography or publishing books on composition. Today, I just hold the button down and take 60 photographs of my kid, and then I can pick the best one. And so the entire business models change. And this transition that we've all lived through, we're now seeing this in all the industries that we can see. Energy is going through this industry today in this transition. And so we go from a material, physical, scarcity-based set of business models to an abundance, digital, low marginal cost environment. And this is happening across all of these technologies and pretty much every industry that we can see. And so here's the huge challenge and opportunity. We're moving the world from scarcity to abundance. And a huge challenge is where are the business models on the abundance side? Because if you're in the old world trying to sell high-end cameras, all the incumbents in many of our industries are still focused on trying to sell scarcity, and many don't make it to the other side of that equation. And so that's the fundamental paradigm that's happening. And as I said, we're seeing this across all of these technologies. And Peter will give you some more examples of where we're seeing this in some of these areas. Here's one way I like to frame it. This is a graph of the cost of light over a 700-year period. And you can see it used to be really expensive to light out a building or a room using torches. I call it Game of Thrones technology. Then we invent candlelight, and it plateaus for a while. And then we find electricity, and the cost crashes to near zero. And we now barely notice the cost of light, right? And what's interesting here is the shape of the curve. Very expensive, plateaus for a while, and then literally crashes to near zero. Because here's the cost of light, but here's the cost of DNA sequencing, and you see the same shape. Very expensive plateaus, and then literally crashes to near zero. Here's the cost of solar energy, and you see the same curve. And in technology after technology, the cost is crashing to near zero. And this is, again, something very, very unique. In the history of our world, advanced technologies cost a lot. And only a government lab or a big private corporation could afford to innovate, do R&D, put out new products and services, and do the work necessary. But today, for the first time in human history, advanced technologies are actually inexpensive. The tools we use to manipulate AI are mostly open source. The blockchain is open source and free. And this is something, again, very, very unique. And so let me touch on the one area, one industry that is very predominant in this region. I know the Bahrain economy is not heavily dependent on oil, but pretty dependent, 30-something%, as I was told earlier today. But here's the cost of solar energy, and looking over a few decades, and it turns out that solar energy is riding this doubling pattern. Solar energy is doubling every 22 months in its price performance. And if you can see the numbers, it's been doing this for 40 years. So for 40 years, the price performance of solar is doubling roughly every 2 years. Hey, if you ride this out, we will be able to deliver 100% of world energy supply with solar in 12 years. We're literally 6 doublings away from being able to deliver all of our energy needs globally with solar energy. which of course will have a huge disruptive effect all around the world. If you're in oil and gas, you need to shift out of that very quickly. And I know that's a predominant thing in parts of the world. I'm Canadian. 40% of Canadian exports are oil. So the fundamental foundation of the Canadian economy will be destroyed in the next 10 years. And they're Canadian, so they don't do anything about it, which is a huge challenge. Here's the relative cost of solar to other fuels. You can see the incredible multiplier effect there. And I showed you this graph already. There are two very important things about this graph. First, we must remember that once you have a doubling pattern, that doubling pattern doesn't stop. So if we can deliver 100% of world energy supply in 12 years, for example, and it's doubling every 2 years, it means in 14 years we can deliver 200% of our energy needs. In 16 years we can deliver 400%. In 18 years we can deliver 800%, and that just keeps going. So energy, which has been scarce for the entire history of humanity, is now about to become abundant. And that will have, of course, massive impact around the world. Here's the relative cost of solar to other fuels. You saw that already. About a quarter of the farms in California are now solar-powered. And in the most ultimate irony that I've been able to see, the Coal Museum in Kentucky is using solar panels to power itself. Right? I just don't know how you look in the mirror on this one. And so we see this. When you see these broad inflection points, you find these nonsensical events that don't seem to make any sense. Now the enormous challenge is storage. Yes, you can generate a lot of energy. How do you store it? And so this is the big trillion-dollar challenge today. Utilities are now pumping water up hills during the day and using hydro at night. Wind technology is counter-cyclical to solar, so that's helpful in some ways. Battery technology is moving very quickly, but not enough to take over the entire baseload. By the way, lithium-ion batteries have dropped 90% in their cost just in this decade. So we're seeing incredible movement on that side. So I actually tried to live this myself. If you're going to talk about this, you have to have some experiential basis for this. So 3 years ago, I took a Tesla and I drove from Miami all the way up to Toronto, 2,500 kilometers. And I would stop at the charging stations and charge the car. It charges at about 500 kilometers an hour, so about a half-hour stop would be enough. And it was a really fascinating, and I would get on the highway and I would hit the button for the car to drive itself. And at the time, the car drove itself about 35% of the time. If I got into construction, it got confused. Road cones would confuse the car, et cetera, et cetera. But it was a fascinating trip. More interestingly, so this happened 3 years ago, then 18 months later, I drove back. And so the difference in the trip was slightly shorter. You can see it was a slightly 9 stops in 11 instead of 11. But look at that bottom row. When I drove the car up, as I said, the car drove itself about 35% of the time. When I drove it back, same car, same sensors, now it's driving itself 80% of the time. And that difference is just better software, better analytics, that many more cars have mapped the streets, et cetera, et cetera. Now think of the broader implications of this. I got into a car which was basically a first-class train cabin. That's basically what it is, right? It drove me across the country 80% of the time by itself. And because the charging stations are free, the entire trip of 2,500 kilometers cost me $0. It was free. Now when we go back and forth, I say to my wife, you fly, I'll take the car. Right? I load up with about 5 shawarma kebabs and drive, and I make about 60 phone calls, and I catch up with all of the work that I can't do when I'm stuck doing normal work. So this is an amazing experience. And so this is what I call a Gutenberg moment. In the 15th century, the printing press was introduced, democratized access to literature, and we totally changed the world. And we call that now a Gutenberg moment for the fundamental shift that had in society. I will argue with all of these technologies going on today that we have today about a dozen Gutenberg moments hitting us all at the same time. Because just solar energy changes the world completely. Then you have autonomous cars. That changes the world. Drones, biotech breakthroughs, neuroscience breakthroughs, AI, robotics, et cetera, et cetera. The list just goes on. right? So we are being hit with this incredible onslaught of innovation in a way that we've never seen before in the world. This is a completely unique history and moment in time. Now, the broader implications of this are quite profound. I talked about the shift from scarcity to abundance in business models, but every institution that we use to run the world doesn't work in the world that is coming. All of our mechanisms, our healthcare systems, legal systems, intellectual property, education, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago, not for today. Definitely not for 1 trillion sensors coming down the pike. And now we have to re-architect all of our institutions all over the world to map for this new world. As an example, take education. All of our educational systems are designed to take a young child, train them through their early 20s to be ready for the existing job market. Right? That's pretty much all the education systems are geared for. Small problem, we don't know what a job looks like in 5 years. What are we teaching them? Right? So that's just one small piece. But take democracy. In many parts of the world, we invented representative democracies a few hundred years ago at a time when information was scarce. So if you were in Washington, D.C., you literally had no idea what was happening in California because the speed of a horse was as fast as you could find out. That's why Congress or Parliament meets occasionally to give people time to cross the country and say, here's what my people are thinking. But today we have an abundance of information, gets misused, misinterpreted, faked, and every major democracy in the world is broken. India, where I'm from, originally broken. Brazil, broken. The UK broke 3 years ago. The US breaking in front of our eyes. So major democracies don't work. The metabolism of a democracy is moving too slowly for the pace of change of technology. And you see this result. This is what's causing all of the stress in the world, is we have a dozen major Gutenberg moments and our institutions can't cope. On a lighter note, take the institution of marriage. We invented marriage about 9,000 years ago, was when that first surfaced in human history. And at the time, average lifespan, 9,000 years ago, was about 23 years old. So you got married and you had kids and you died. Marriage is not supposed to last 50, 60 years, right? My wife calls it state-sanctioned torture. Basically, right? So we have these institutions that were designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore. Yet what happens when you try and update our institutions? You have this enormous immune system reaction. And we want to keep things stable. We want to keep things in the status quo. And that doesn't really work. And so I could go on, but every single one of these institutions, take the UN Security Council, which was set up to mitigate conflicts between states. Except today, 80% of conflicts are civil wars, and the UN Security Council has nothing to say. And how do you update the UN Security Council? Very, very difficult. And so every institution that we use to run the world has to be re-architected, which is one of the reasons this region has so much opportunity, because you have the opportunity to completely re-architect society. You're a small country with global ambitions, and you can actually do that. Over the past few hundred years, it was a huge advantage to be a big country. You had lots of natural resources, critical mass in multiple industries, et cetera, and it was very helpful to be a big country like Saudi Arabia, US, or Brazil, Russia, etc. Today, it's a huge liability to be a big country. It's too difficult, not adaptable, is very anti-fragile, etc. All the advantages today exist with small countries because you can leapfrog the rest of the world. Here's the Fourth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, the right to privacy. We have fundamentally lost the right to privacy in the U.S. A fundamental pillar of American society has disappeared with no public conversation about it because of the onslaught of technology. That's how basic and fundamental this is going along. So those are two very key things. The third part of this is the sheer, as we digitize, we have a huge demonetization effect. So we're seeing two things happen on the economy. First is the metabolism is accelerating, right? It took 20 years to create $1 billion industry or marketplace. Now that's happening literally in months. And so the pace of change in the metabolism is accelerating. But more importantly, what we find is when you digitize an industry and you go end-to-end digital, you tend to have a huge deflationary cliff. You can see the newspaper industry trundling along, and then we digitized news, and boom, there was a 6 times drop in revenues in just 2 years. Here's the music industry, a 10x drop in revenues. Note that it's called the media industry because they used to sell the physical media, right? Cassettes, DVDs, CDs, et cetera, but you digitize it, and what happens? We had 8 major music studios around the world selling scarcity as a business model. We digitize music. All 8 music studios pretty much disappear. And now we have 2 platforms, iTunes and Spotify, selling an abundance of music on a subscription model. So you spend $10 or $15 a month, you get unlimited abundance of information. And so more importantly, all the scarcity people are gone. Right? None of them can survive this. And it's, as I said before at the beginning, it's very, very hard to spot this disruption. And I want to spend a little time on this. If there's one piece of this presentation I'd love for you to remember afterwards, this is it. The difficulty that we have in seeing this disruption. So when the Google car first came out 10 years ago, the cost of the LiDAR, the GPS, the radar, the sensors added up to about $200,000 per car. And all the car companies, every single one of them looked at that and said, cute research project, but you'll never commercialize it. Who's going to pay $200,000 a car? Except 2 years later, it dropped by 50%. It was $100,000 a car. 2 years later, it was $50,000 a car. And still the response was, who will pay $50,000 for all those sensors? Today, we're below $1,000 a car across all the sensors because it went from 50, 2 years later, 25, 2 years later, 12, 6, 3, and now we're below $1,000. And now everybody's freaking out about this. The cost of this LiDAR unit at the top of this Prius cost $75,000 earlier this decade. And anybody know what it is today? Today, that unit costs about $40. Why? Because inside that little piece of equipment are about 3 technologies that are all dropping 50% each. So if you have one technology, it drops the cost 50%. If you have 2 or 3, the multiplier is unbelievable. Now, I'll give you a little thought experiment. Go back to 2012 and tell the car industry that the LiDAR unit will be basically free by the end of the decade, and watch the response. You'll be given a white coat and some medicine and asked to stand in the corner because clearly you've lost your mind. Right? It's the same conversation happening in other industries that we see today. The next unit, by the way, will be $10, and it will dematerialize the way we've seen GPS receivers dematerialize. So this is what happened with autonomous cars. But here's another example. Vinod Khosla did an amazing piece of research. We saw exponential growth in the 2000s decade of mobile phones. We went from 100 million mobile phones to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1.6 billion, doubling every 2 years through the decade. Vinod went back through the decade and asked an interesting question. He asked the question, how well did the mobile industry expert analysts predict and catch that pace of change? The Gartners, the Forresters, the Jupiters, the McKinseys, etc. So in 2002, he went back and found that the collective average, their prediction of the growth of mobile phones was 16% growth, except it went up 100%. But their next prediction didn't go up, it went down. Their next prediction was 14%. Then it went up another 100%, and guess what happened? Their next prediction went down because they kept expecting it to level off. They said, okay, we made a mistake, we saw 100% growth, it can't possibly continue, so they went down in their estimates. In fact, in 2008, they predicted 10% growth in the mobile phone industry, and it went up another 100%. Now, how much more wrong can you be from 100% to 10%? You should lose your job. Right? And governments and big companies are using these predictions and these projections from the top research analysts in the world to make their estimates. And they're all wrong. When you have an information-based environment, the experts in that industry go linear. And let me give you an even more dramatic example of this. Here you have in the black, the black line is the actual growth of solar energy globally over the last 15, 20 years, growing exponentially up in very hockey stick formation. And what you see in the colored lines is the predictions from the top energy experts in the world as to where will solar go. And what you see is on every step of that curve, that exponential curve, the experts go linear. Right? For 15 years, solar energy is going like this, and the prediction is no, it will level off. Every single one. I've blanked out 2018 just for effect. Here's 2018, He predicts they go down. I don't know how you get the solar drops in capability when the price performance is dropping 50% every 2 years. This is unbelievable. And then we found this to be true across industry after industry after industry. When you see exponential growth, the experts in that industry all go linear. Now, when you go back to your companies, think about this. All of your companies have experts that have 10, 20, 30 years expertise in that industry. If you see a domain that's growing exponentially, they can't see it. They literally cognitively cannot see it. And it's just very, very hard. I was talking to the chairman of Frost & Sullivan, one of these research firms, and he really framed it well. He said, if you have an exponential curve and you miss one step, you're off by 50%. It's a very hard thing to track. And let me give you a real-world macro example of this. So over the course of this decade, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, if you owned a car wash, you've seen 50% drop in revenues. So car washes in Buenos Aires have seen a 50% drop in revenues. And people were wondering, why would you see a 50% drop in revenues? The middle class has exploded. They've bought a ton of Mercedes and BMWs. Argentinians are very proud. They like to keep their cars clean. You should see a doubling or tripling of revenue. Why is there a 50% drop? Are there legal issues? Are there water restrictions? Is there hyper competition? What exactly is going on? And one of our colleagues who's down there spends 3 months researching this problem. I'm trying to figure out why are there 50% drops in revenues. And he's able to get rid of all of the obvious possibilities like hyper competition or legal issues or water restrictions. And then he finds the answer. And the answer turns out to be literally Moore's Law. Because our computing capability has gone up dramatically, we're much better at predicting the weather, and our models for how we predict the weather have gone up much better. And in this decade, we're exactly 50% better at knowing when it's going to rain. And when you know it's going to rain, you don't wash your car. And you can be the smartest car wash owner in the world, and you will not see that. Right? And we call this the orthogonal effect of disruption, where something affects you even though it's not obvious why. And so the possibility you have to take and the stance you have to take and the starting point is that your industry will be disrupted somehow. And you may not see it coming. The question is, how do you react to that disruption? Bill Gates calls it the healthy paranoia that you should have around this, because you won't see it coming, right? Even though it's in front of you, even if you can see it, you reject it, as we saw in our previous thing. And the reason this is unstoppable and inexorable is this final piece, which is the democratization. Because as the cost of these technologies drops, anybody and everybody can innovate in this capability. And we're seeing now all of these technologies go through this type of a curve, where a domain becomes digital, the costs drop to zero, you get open source communities forming, and then you get radical disruption of the status quo. And whether it's drones or blockchain or Bitcoin or whatever, we're seeing this in industry after industry after industry. Here's one of my favorite examples. This is a fishing village in Vietnam, and once a month a big ship would come to deliver diesel fuel for their fishing boats. One day the ship stopped coming. It didn't make sense. It didn't make economic sense. And all of a sudden these folks have no diesel fuel for their shipping boats, for their fishing boats. So they looked on the internet. They threw a solar panel on the top of the canopy and created a solar-powered boat. Now here you have disruptive innovation using cutting-edge technologies happening at the edge of civilization. And we get really excited when we see this, because when they get their hands on drones and blockchain and all sorts of other things, very interesting things will happen. Today, any entrepreneur can enter a legacy industry with a beginner's mind, leverage new technologies, and totally disrupt it. Right? Elon Musk may be the best example of this. Maybe many of you are familiar with the Hyperloop, where he wants to go like 4,000 miles an hour. He wants to go from LA to San Francisco in 20 minutes, for example. By the way Elon works is very simple. He looks at a technology that's accelerating exponentially. He aims 10 years out. Where will that technology be on a 10-year doubling pattern? And let's build a company to intercept that curve over a 10-year period. That's his methodology. So he designed the Hyperloop and open sourced it, as many of you are familiar. And to give you an example of the mindset, I was talking to him about this. And I said, Elon, I have a degree in theoretical physics. If you accelerate a human being from 0 to 4,000 miles an hour in 20 minutes and decelerate them back to 0 in that time frame, you're probably going to kill them. And his response was, yes, it's an issue. That was his response. It's a problem, right? I'm looking at it as an impossibility. You should just stop the project. And he's like, yeah, we have to overcome that speed bump. And this is the mindset that many of our young entrepreneurs have, and many of you hopefully have in the room. It's very inexpensive to innovate. There's no barriers to entry. Information-based environments allow us to disrupt anything. Here's another example. You can get today $100 headsets that give you a pretty good feedback view as to what brainwave frequencies are going through your brain. So if you're in prayer or meditative state, you have theta wave frequencies. If you're trying to focus, you want alpha wave frequencies. And if you're driving and you're trying to avoid a dog in the street, you have beta wave urgent frequencies in your brain. So I'm going to describe this to you. So this is me in the left, the silhouette there wearing a headset. In the middle, you see the readout from my brain. And on the right is the inventor of a website called Focus at Will, which streams music. And the design is to put your brain in a focused alpha state. So here's my brain before and after he plays the music. You can see my brain is in this focused state. Okay? This is amazing, right? So my brain is now in a focused state, and he can measure it. So he's created a website called Focus at Will. You plug your headset into this Pandora-type headset, your brain goes into a focused state. When my brain is in that state, my productivity increases 500%. Every student, every knowledge worker, every software developer in the world could use this instantly, right? And what's his cost of development? It's a Mac and a $100 headset. That's it. And his background, by the way, he used to play guitar for the Eurythmics, the band from the 1980s. And so he's composing music that puts your brain in that state. And so this will totally revolutionize the world in interesting ways. And here's another example. This is a company out of Miami that has created this pad that you see there, which a woman puts on as a test. And it does a very detailed temperature measurement across that part of the body. And it checks the temperature between left and right. Turns out it's 80% better at detecting breast cancer than a mammogram. 80% better. The cost is absurdly low. It's just a pad with temperature sensors on it. And it's FDA approved. So we can now totally transform breast cancer globally, especially in this region where people have a little bit more conservative attitudes, literally by using this device. So the opportunities for human advancement are unbelievable using information-based thinking, right? So this is what's incredible. Okay, so hopefully you get the disruption, and Peter will talk more tomorrow about the shift in this world going from scarcity to abundance and some of the more of the breakthroughs in technologies. How do you then react? What do you do about this? And let me spend this last part talking through what do you do. If you're running a business or if you're running a governmental organization, how do you react? So a few years ago, this quote has been stuck in my head for quite a long time. This is David Rose, one of the godfathers of angel investing, making the comment that all of our organizations are top-down hierarchical pyramid command and control structures designed for scarcity, designed for efficiency, designed for predictability. Right? All of our organization structures are designed in this top-down pyramid hierarchical way. Except today you have to be architected for agility, flexibility, adaptability, and speed. And none of our organizational structures fit this, especially in large organizations, both private and public sector. And we did a bunch of research and found that over the last, say, decade, we're seeing a completely new breed of organization appear that operates on a totally different heuristic. And so we wrote this book that's now 5 years old, came out talking about a new breed of organization being created. And the definition is that we're seeing a new breed of organization that is delivering 10 times better, faster, cheaper than their colleagues or competitors in the same space. So if your organization can deliver 10x, 10 times better performance than your competitors using a variety of techniques, we classify that as an exponential organization. We were actually tracking an index of about 100 or so of these companies. A good example is TED. 10, 15 years ago, TED was just a nice conference in LA. About 1,000 people a year are going to this conference, very scarcity-driven. Chris Anderson takes it over. He does three things. He establishes a huge purpose, ideas worth spreading. Right? Then he gives away all the TED Talks for free on YouTube, leveraging rich media. Then he allows anybody in the world to go create a TEDx event. And in 10 years, he's created a global media brand. Right? So think about that. He's gone from a local environment to a global brand in 10 years at almost zero cost. That's what's possible today. And so that's interesting. But let me go to a more traditional industry. This is a company called Local Motors, which is a car company. And they have a social network of about 150,000 car enthusiasts, car designers, car mechanics that help design cars. And the numbers are incredible. If you're a typical car company, it costs about $3 billion to design a new car from scratch. If you're Audi, BMW, Toyota, they can design a completely new car for $3 million. That's 1,000 times better than the status quo. A typical car has 25,000 parts. Theirs has 50. A typical car takes about 1,000 man-hours to put together. Theirs takes 1. And a typical car factory is 1 million square feet, and theirs can be made literally on the size of this state. So here are 4 metrics on which they're blowing away the status quo by multiple orders of magnitude each. So if you're a traditional car company, how do you deal with this? How do you compete? You can't. You have 3 options. Number 1, buy them, shut them down. That's option 1. Right? And we've seen that in the payments industry and certain industries. But now, because of democratization, there's 1,000 of these. You can't shut down 1,000. So that's not an option. Option 2, lobby the government and pass regulation and get legislation passed. That car can't possibly be safe, and do regulatory capture, which is a favorite tactic in the US. But that's too long, it's too expensive today, etc. Think about Uber. Uber is successful by deliberately breaking the law, leapfrogging to public acceptance, and waiting for policy to catch up. Not very pleasant, but it's certainly working for them. Option 3 is find out what techniques they're using and reverse it into your companies, which is obviously the technique we suggest. So there's 3 pieces that go into building what we call an exponential organization. The first is all of them have what I call a massive transformative purpose, what we call an MTP. Google has organized the world's information. XPRIZE, radical breakthroughs for humanity. TED, ideas worth spreading. And what we're starting to see now is brands are morphing into this. You see there at the bottom, Coca-Cola's recent mantra, open happiness. Okay? In fact, Paul Pullman, who was the CEO of Unilever, read the book, ordered every brand in Unilever to take on an MTP. And as of a year ago, the 5 most profitable brands in Unilever are the ones that have adopted this the most. So we're starting to see the model really bite. Every exponential organization has this at the core heart of it. Our own MTP is to transform business globally. That's our own massive purpose. Then there's 5 externalities that these companies use that allow them to keep a very small footprint and use 1 or more of these techniques to scale very quickly. Uber doesn't hire its own staff. TED uses community. Google is using algorithms. Airbnb is leveraging other people's assets, and so on. Right? And so it allows you to keep a very small footprint and use 1 or more of these to scale quickly. And then there's 5 internal mechanisms that allow you to drive the control structure, control framework, management measurement techniques, and culture. The lean startup methodology, or real-time dashboards, or decentralized organizations. Right? How many of you are familiar with Valve software? Anybody here? So Valve is a software company out of Seattle. They have about 400 people. They have no CEO. They have no reporting lines. They have no job descriptions. They have no management meetings of any kind. They literally operate like a beehive. Okay? So if there's a bug in the software, I grab 3 people that I think can fix that bug. We go fix it. We disband. Every employee self-selects as to what they want to do. And it sounds like a joke, but they get more revenue per employee than Microsoft by doing this. The poster child of this technique is this large Chinese appliance manufacturer called Haier. Many of you are familiar with Haier. A few years ago, the CEO looked at his organization, 80,000 people operating in a classic pyramid hierarchical structure, and they make 55 million fridges and ovens a year. Okay? And he looked at his organization and he decided, I can't meet my corporate goals this way. So he blew it up, turned 80,000 people into 2,000 autonomous teams of about 40 people each. Each team elects their own leader. Each team has a P&L responsibility. Each team decides whatever they want to do. They self-select. Now, I challenge you an interesting question. Go to any business school in the world and say, I want to make 55 million fridges, and you'll get architected for you a classic centralized product strategy, demand forecasting, inventory management, supply chain, all centralized. And it turns out it's not true. It turns out you can run a totally decentralized organization. Each team decides whatever they want to do, and you can make 55 million fridges. In fact, GE, 3 years ago, gave up trying to compete with this and sold GE appliances to them. So when they have to decide what features should go into the new fridge, 2,000 teams vote. And because they're all interacting with customers, partners, vendors, suppliers, they get a much better outcome than some centralized product team trying to understand market research and focus groups, et cetera. So it turns out you don't need 80,000 people in centralized formation to do this. Who knew? Right? So totally fascinating. So we found in our research that if you're doing a startup, you should be using all of these. Because if you're not, somebody else is. In fact, we're now starting to hear in the future, you will not be building a startup, you'll be building an exponential organization. And if you're a big company, if you fully implement 4 out of the 10, you get a 10x performance improvement in your world. So here's the highest rated EXO we ever saw, the company called GitHub. How many of you are familiar with GitHub? So GitHub is a software platform for software developers to collaborate and exchange ideas, et cetera, et cetera. 10 years old. Microsoft just bought this company for $7.5 billion. And let me give you the metrics. This company has no workforce, no intellectual property, no assets. $7.5 billion. If you're not building one of these, what are you doing? And this is what's possible in today's world. I'll repeat, no assets, no intellectual property, barely any workforce, $7.5 billion. That's what's possible today. That's how much value you can create by using these techniques. So this is a totally new world that we live in. So we actually went on CNBC and decided, let's apply this to big companies. And we did an analysis of the Fortune 100 and scored the Fortune 100 companies by how flexible and adaptable their organization is. So we'd ask them 20 questions like this. So for example, to what extent do you tolerate failure in your organization? So level 1 is we don't tolerate failure at all. If you fail, your career is ended. Level 2 is we say we tolerate failure, but really we don't. Really you're done. Level 3 is that we'll test it and do it in innovation areas, et cetera. And level 4 is we actually measure it across the company. Amazon, for every team as Amazon, is asking the question, how many experiments did you run this quarter? How many succeeded? How many failed? If you're not running enough experiments and testing the boundary conditions, not enough, and you're not failing enough, something's wrong. And your bonus actually gets impacted. So we asked like 20, 25 questions like this. So here's the Fortune 100 ranked by how flexible their organization structure is. And we found 2 things out of this. One, we found a correlation to stock market performance. Because as the external world becomes more volatile, your ability to adapt will drive market performance. More importantly, if you'd invested in the top 10 most flexible and adaptable companies in our index, you would have outperformed the stock market by almost 3 times. So there's a really interesting index fund here waiting to be created. And so what do we do if you have a legacy company? We wanted to also address that. And so we spent about a third of the book dealing with what do you do if you have an existing company. So number 1, update your leadership, that we are in a new world. And events like this are designed for that, right? Hopefully you come out of this event realizing fundamentally that the world is fundamentally changing. But number 2 is the most structurally relevant. Number 2 is do not do disruptive innovation in the core organization. You'll find this immune system response, the company will hate you, and you'll get into an internal political fight. Do disruptive innovation at the edge of the organization, pointing away. Larry Page from Google came to me a few years ago, and he said, hey, your unit at Yahoo is successful. Should I do that at Google? And I said, no, you'll have this immune system response, but do something like it, keep it stealth, and point it into adjacent areas. And you see the result with Google X, where the core company manages information, and they add hardware at the edges, Google Glass, Google Car, contact lenses, to go into adjacent spaces. The master of this technique is Apple. And yes, they have a great design capability, and yes, they have a great technology supply chain. I will argue that Apple's core innovation is actually organizational. Because what they do, unlike any other company in the world, is they will form a small team that's very disruptive. They will take that team to the edge of the organization. They will keep them completely stealth and secret, and they will say to that team, go disrupt another industry. Right? Nobody does this. Nobody's even noticed. No analyst has noticed that this is what they do. So they have a portfolio of teams analyzing different industries, and when they think something is ready for disruption, whether it's watches or retail or payments or cars, they go into it and fold it back into the overall platform. And so that's the way to architect yourself if you're a legacy organization, because you cannot do disruptive innovation in the core organization, and yet disruptive innovation is the only thing that will give you some success. There's a bunch of war stories here. I'll give a couple. Nespresso, great success story. For 3 or 4 years, Nestle tried to run Nespresso as a line of business, and it failed. Finally, they put it as a separate entity at the edge. Boom, it's a $6 billion line of business. Walmart is a really great failure mode, an example of where this failed. Walmart realized about 10 years ago they had to compete with Amazon, that this whole e-commerce thing was not a fad. They had to take it seriously. So it created a team inside headquarters and said, we have the best logistics, distribution, inventory management in the world. Let's go beat Amazon. Within 18 months, the immune system killed it. All the executives said, we should be optimizing for our own stores. Look at that PE ratio. It'll never succeed, etc. So they did it a second time. And the second time, they put a team at the edge and said, okay, let's go solve this, but use our existing systems because we have the best in the world. We should leverage that. 18 months later, that was dead because the business found out and killed it. They did it a third time where they made a very courageous decision, take a team to the edge, and they said to the team, go build your own independent distribution, logistics, supply chain, even though we have the best in the world, because we have to figure this out. It started to succeed that third time. The business got excited, pulled it back in, and killed it. And it was on the fourth iteration they did it at the edge, separately, independently, and only after it achieved its own critical mass did they finally catch on. Then they started connecting the back ends of the business with this edge organization. But in that intervening 8 years, Amazon's gone. And so you can't afford to wait around and test this. And these are some of the smartest people in the world not able to figure this out, right? So what we think about, and my colleague Emily, where's Emily? Emily's in the room there, is now running a practice doing this. We suggest taking your current organization, architecting it to spin off these EXOs off the edge. And if you're successful, the exponential organization should become bigger than the mothership. That's the aim of the work that we do. In fact, we saw this. If Marriott had created and spun off Airbnb, Booking.com, TripAdvisor, its market cap would be 4 times higher than it is today. And all of those ideas existed inside Marriott, but couldn't get activated because the immune system kills it. And think about in your own organization, if somebody has a disruptive idea, there's nowhere for them to take it. All the existing organization is optimized for efficiency and predictability and cannot handle it, and it will kill that disruptive idea, even though it's such a great idea. And so this is what the opportunity. In fact, the largest retailer in Brazil did this. The largest retailer in Brazil spun off a separate e-commerce company, kept it independent, and as of a year ago, the e-commerce company is now generating more revenues than the mothership. So we have now a precedent for this. And the work that we now do is we run 10-week processes. We've done it with Diwa in Dubai and Alec. We're running 10-week processes that solve this immune system problem. We take teams of people inside a company, help them ride at this process, and the aim is to move leadership culture, management thinking 3 years ahead in 10 weeks. So we found out how to hack culture at scale. We've done it 30 times now with large organizations around the world. In fact, we're so excited about this, we actually open sourced it and published a book saying, here's the methodology, because every one of the Global 5,000 has to go through this process with or without us. We piloted it with Procter & Gamble. P&G has gotten about $1 billion of value from running this process. Even then, we thought, okay, maybe we got lucky. P&G is very advanced. We ran it a second time with the largest insurance company in Mexico, family-owned backward insurance regulated. In 3 years, they've doubled revenues and tripled profits. And so we found a methodology now to hack culture at scale in a big company, and which is why we wrote this book. So I'm going to pause there. We've left a little bit of time for questions and answers. I want to just highlight to you that we are operating in a totally different world. Hopefully this Dalmatian image is now stuck in your brain. We are in a world where we have a dozen technologies all doubling on this capability. We're turning the world into information, and we're finding business models from scarcity to abundance. And there's not a single industry in the world that we can't find that we don't see being disrupted. But if you're a small company, it used to be you would have a difficult time competing against the big company. If you were a small country, it was difficult to compete against the big countries. But today, being small, agile, flexible is all of the advantages in the world. You can leapfrog the rest of the world, both as a country and if you have a small company. And so this is why we're so excited about conferences like this, because you can now take on a totally new paradigm and build it in a totally new way. So I'll pause there. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great to be here. Thank you. So we have for questions. So I'm just going to open it up. 2 or 3 questions. Does anybody have a question in the audience? And we'll get you. Yes, ma'am. There's a question here. Can we get a mic? Or if we don't have a mic, you can yell your question. I'll repeat it for the audience.
Hello, and thank you very much for doing the presentation. When we talk about disruption, I would like to ask, what should a company do today when they see the disruption coming in the future? And what I'm thinking here, it's an example. We talked yesterday about the fiber optics, that we want to make the internet connection be faster.
Yes.
But what do we do when we know that Starlink is coming and the internet will be provided from above?
Yeah, so what do you do with fiber optic cables if you're dealing with that? Number one, invest in the new technologies that are delivering the edge innovation. Go look at a company called Tarana Wireless, which is actually a Saudi engineer in Silicon Valley who's built last mile gigabit broadband wireless. Okay, last mile point-to-point gigabit bandwidth. This is what's possible today. Now, so you have to invest in those types of technologies because they're coming. But I'm more optimistic about the fiber world than most, because as we have 1 trillion sensors coming, we will need a huge amount of bandwidth. And there's certain sectors like healthcare or security where you don't want to trust a satellite connection, right? If my heart pacemaker is on the internet, I want to make sure it's as wired a connection as possible, right? I don't want to trust that there's a satellite, some meteor hits something, and my pacemaker has a problem. So healthcare, security, certain applications, we think there will be a strong need for wired connections as much as possible in the world. Certainly we'll have lots of areas, especially in newer areas, new developments, we'll do wireless pretty much everywhere, but I think we'll end up laying fiber there anyway, just because of the need for that. Yeah, so I'm more optimistic at the moment. Okay, last question. Yes, sir.
I was impressed on your the solar, where you said the cost was 77 and it dropped to 50 cents.
Yes.
But I think the real breakthrough would be storage.
Yes.
Anything is coming in the storage?
Yes, there's a ton of the storage problem. You've nailed it very well. It's one thing to generate all the electricity and generate the power. Where do you store it? So there's a number of different solutions. Whoever solves that problem, by the way, is a trillionaire. Okay, so if you want an area to go into, you can solve that. So I'll give you a couple of examples. SoftBank has a company called Energy Vault, where you put power and it lifts a weight with pulleys using that power, and then it uses the energy as it drops to generate, so small scale. I've actually proposed an XPRIZE for large scale storage stationary to solve for that, right? So if you could have a storage capability, so there's other ways of doing chemical storage. So there's basically 3 or 4 ways of storing energy: spin, gravity, motion, etc., and chemistry. So today we can actually take the energy, heat up molten salt, heat it up to a high temperature, and then it stores, it keeps that heat And then when you need the heat, you can extract the heat. Right? So there's a number of mechanisms around this. There's about 5,000 companies working to crack that problem, and we're pretty sure it will be cracked. Graphene, for example, a new substance, is showing enormous promise in storing energy at a very, very low cost and high density. Some of the new battery technologies that we're seeing are literally 1,000 times more energy than lithium ion. Okay? And so and just to give you an example of that democratization, in the past, if you were a materials engineer and you wanted to think about a new battery material, you'd maybe hypothesize that maybe lithium air or lithium sulfur is better than lithium ion, and you'd go test that property, and you do linear sequential R&D. Right? You test one, doesn't work. You test another, doesn't work. The next one, maybe the voltage retention isn't high enough, etc., or the thermal properties are wrong. But today there's a database called the Materials Project, and you can go check this out. It's called the Materials Project, where they've taken 500,000 compounds and put into a big database the chemical, physical, electrical properties of 500,000 compounds. So if I need a new material that gives me this voltage retention with these thermal properties, instead of testing each one, I can literally go to this database, put in my requirements, and it'll give me, here are the 5 compounds you should test. I was talking to the CEO of 3M, and he was kind of freaked out by this database, because all of their capabilities creating new compounds now, and this database is open source and free. Right? And so material science now transforms very completely. The storage problem is the fundamentally most interesting problem in the energy sector today. And with that, I think we're done. Thank you very much. Almost.
I have one question for you.
Sure.
Based on everything that you know, I think my underlying message that I got is, we know nothing. Are you excited or scared about the future?
Oh, I'm massively, massively excited for a very fundamental reason. We've seen throughout the history of humanity that technology is a major driver of progress in the world. It actually might be the only major driver of progress in the world today. And now we have a dozen technologies all doubling in their capability annually. The world has never seen this much innovation. We'll nail breast cancer in the next 2 or 3 years.
I've thought of a new business, and that is corporate therapy for the future. Well, giving therapy to executives who can't manage tomorrow.
Or drugs.
We don't want to go there.
Yeah.
Salim, thank you very much. Round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Great stuff. Thank you.